Good morning, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome to the Trauma and Learning National Press webcast. I have a couple of housekeeping items for everyone. First off, everyone is on mute, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions following the speakers and the presentation. You can also use the chat function. So if you look on your Citrix web tool, you'll see that there's a chat box, and so you can use that. So you won't be able to speak, but you'll be able to, speak with me during the webcast if you have any questions. And we also want to direct you to the traumaandlearning.org website where you can find additional materials, which, if you go there, you can see the video that we'll show. You can see some different press materials and complaints. And I'm just going to do a little check to see if everyone can hear me or if everything's working properly on your end. So if you're having any trouble, please just use the chat function. Otherwise, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. All right, I'll take that silence as we're ready to go and no one is having any trouble. So I would like to now introduce Mark Rosenbaum, who is the directing attorney of Public Counsel's Opportunity Under Law project. And Mark will join us in just a few moments. You'll all be able to see him. Great. All right, Mark, we're unable to hear you. 1 second, everyone, bear with us. All right.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here. Before I begin, I know on behalf of all the lawyers, representatives, we want to thank the students and their teachers with whom we have been working for the past several months in the preparation of this litigation and who were generous to share their lives and their experiences with us. We want to talk to you today about this landmark case that we are filing this morning. But before we do so, I want to have you listen to the words of the student plaintiffs, some of the student plaintiffs in this case. They range in age from 15 to 18. Those who are under 18 by requirements of federal law are anonymous. But now I invite you to listen to the words on the video. If the sound is problematic in any way, you can get a clear copy by just going to the web link here.
I've always had an interest in photography, and I feel like photography can take people somewhere that they don't have a chance to. The stuff I grew up around, you don't really get a chance to explore this stuff. When my mom and dad got a divorce, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I came back out here when I was 5, 6. I didn't really know what nothing was too much. Like, I'm so used to trees, animals, and running, so I didn't really know what guns and marijuana and cocaine. I didn't know what all that was until I got introduced to it. I'm not gonna say it's too hard growing up in Compton, but it's a real difficult. It's a bumpy ride. Stuff you gotta to go through. Like, you gotta think about, if you go to practice at 8 at night, Are you gonna find a way home, or are you gonna be safe and be able to make it home walking this late at night? And I was shot at by the police. I'm blessed to be here today. You know, are you gonna be shot, robbed, killed? That's what it comes down to. I seen somebody get shot in the head. I was like, hey, my mom don't even know this. Somebody got shot in the back of the head with a shotgun, and they threw him over the rail, and he was just sitting there bleeding, blood all down the little sewer line. It was a horrifying sight, you know. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, you know. If that person see you, they will try to kill you, hunt you down. I never talk to anyone. That's what I was taught. Never talk. Keep your mouth shut. It's a blessing to make it out of Compton, really. Compton is like quicksand. It's just like, if you make it out of quicksand, you made it. You ain't gonna die. Education at Compton was really hard. The substitutes and teachers talk to you like you trash. And when you say something back, they call the police or they kick you out. When you say something, it automatically don't matter. That's why I really don't trust schools.
I love English and I love writing. I want to be a poet. In one of my classes, there are 3 teachers. I was going out with a girl at the time, and I kissed her goodbye and I went into class, and I sat down, and this girl turns around and looks at me and asks me about my sexual preference. She asked me, "Are you gay?" And I told her, "Yeah, I think so." And then my teacher looks at me and says, "Why would you do that? Why would you be gay?" And I looked at him like I thought he was playing around, but then my other teacher jumped in and says, "Yeah, that's wrong. You shouldn't be doing that." And then I told him, this is how I felt. This is what I wanted to do. This is how I wanted to be. And they just kept telling me how wrong it was to be how I was. But I was barely coming out, and I felt like, everybody should know. And I thought everybody would be accepting. And I just lost a lot of respect for those teachers. I didn't go to school for a long time. I didn't go to that class for a long time because I felt so, bad about what they were saying to me. I wanted to commit suicide a couple years ago, and it was just getting really hard for me, socializing, and I didn't want to, I was really, sad, and I didn't want to do anything. And I felt like if I had talked to someone, I would be okay.
I was around 3 years old, and I used to have nightmares a lot, and I used to sleep with my mom and dad. I woke up to my dad yelling at my mom, screaming, "I'm done," pointing the gun at her. And then after that, I can't remember what they were arguing about, but they were just yelling at each other, and he took off his wedding ring and threw it on the bed. And the next thing I can remember is him walking out. Ever since that night, when he pulled that gun out, I had nightmares a lot. But now, as I've gotten older, I've learned how to control them better, or just deal with them. I wouldn't say control, more like manage. I used to love school. Like when I was near elementary, I liked it. And when I was at Vanguard, I liked it there as well. But the thing is, one of my counselors, she said she looked at my file, and when she looked at it, she said, "Oh, I'm not even going to deal with this student. Kids in Compton are like numbers. If you're a number, and people more than likely aren't going to want to deal with you." If it wasn't for Mr. Curry, probably wouldn't even go to class anymore. Mr. Curry, he's just the type of person where he's actually gotten to know every single one of the students. I said I'm worried about a lot, and my brother, my family, and stuff, and situations I've been in, and he just sat down and talked to me. Never had somebody just random come into your life and just actually sit down and talk to you about your problems. Like, I think if more teachers were more like Mr. Curry, students would care about their education, you would have a school that actually seemed like a real school. I've been through rough situations. Before my mom got pregnant with me and after she gave birth to me, my mom was doing drugs. And my dad was beating us. He had socked my mom in the stomach while she was pregnant with my little sister. And then he was going to punch her again. And that's where I stepped in and he punched me. And then one day he came home drunk. He just went completely berserk, and I panicked and I called 911. And that's where we were taken from our parents. Me seeing people get shot in my own neighborhood, in my own everywhere I live, is traumatizing. When I'm walking from home to school, or I'm walking to school, I'm gonna have to be alert 24/7 because you never know, someone's gonna drive by and try to shoot you. I've been living at the school for 2 months. That's how bad the school is. You can't even notice that a student is living at the school. And where I was living was on the school roof above the cafeteria. I used 4 carpets. I put one to cover for the wind and the cold. And then I used one for I would lay down, then one for a pillow. I want to figure out a way for the teachers to understand the students. I have flashbacks of what has happened to me when I was a kid. It either makes me mad or makes me sad, or just like whether to put my head down or just want to leave the classroom. And that's why a lot of students do that, because it's either they've been through something and that they don't want to open their mouth. But everyone has their different experiences. Everyone's not built the same. They don't know what's going on in their houses. They're just so stuck. They're trying to change, but they can't. Because when they go home, it's negative. They go to school, it's negative. They're on the streets, it's negative. It's like, where's the positive part in their lives? There isn't. I have a peaceful place. And this peaceful place is when I'm in the mountains and I'm looking up at the stars. I would love to see my school as my peaceful place, where I could be feeling safe, calm, I don't have to worry about anything else. Trauma does affect the students. I want to make my school better because I want my kids to go there. And I want my kids to feel safe in that environment.
Okay. You're going to hear some statements, and then we'll be pleased to take questions from any of you. As you've heard, as you can determine from listening to the voices of these remarkable, beat the odds young people, the number one public health problem in the United States today is the effect of childhood trauma on students' opportunity to learn. The widely known but little addressed scientific fact of life is that childhood trauma can negatively affect the capacity of any child to learn and to succeed in school. But nowhere is this tragic impact greater than in our high poverty neighborhoods and communities, where children like those you've just heard from suffer frequent and severe traumatic episodes that are so stressful that they overwhelm a young person's ability to cope and to learn. Unaddressed trauma is the enemy of the brain. It literally turns off the brain's learning switch. All the experts have told us that the surest way to reduce the achievement gap in America between our have and have-not communities is to address childhood trauma in our public schools. That's what we do if we're genuinely serious about eliminating that gap. Children like those whom you have just heard from are the blameless victims of trauma. They are far too often the victims of physical and or sexual violence. They are far too often witnesses to gun violence, sometimes confronted themselves by gun violence. They far too often live among drug or alcohol addiction. They are far too often subjected to extreme family disruption and hardship, as by death of family members, incarceration, deportation, separation into foster homes, loss of parents and caregivers. They are far too often forced to attempt to contend with the harshest consequences while attempting to succeed in school with all of this going on in their lives. If we as a society cannot eliminate the causes of childhood trauma, attributable in whole or in part to poverty, then we can at least address its effects so that all children can learn and achieve their dreams. But as this landmark case demonstrates, too often schools in our most impoverished communities ignore the fact that their enrollments include high concentrations of children suffering from repeated episodes of trauma. These schools far too often treat their students as bad children, not children to whom bad things happen. We file this case today with respect to children in Compton. We could file it just as easily in communities across the state of California and across the country. Public counsel, therefore, together with the law firm of Irell and Manella, are today, this morning, filing this first of its kind civil rights lawsuit on behalf of school children and 2 teachers of the Compton Unified School District to provide support and relief to the high concentration of students at Compton schools who suffer traumatic experiences of the sorts just identified. We file in order to mitigate and to reverse the impairments trauma produces to reading and concentrating. Federal law mandates that schools like Compton's take steps to address these impairments. And all we are seeking today is that this congressional mandate be implemented by the sorts of proven practices that Ms. Eidman and Ms. Fair will shortly explain. We know that you We will buy good
and I wanted to briefly discuss the steps that schools can and must take to address student trauma. School-wide trauma-sensitive practices are not only effective but necessary accommodations to bolster the resilience of young people and create a supportive environment in which students are able to learn. Whole school trauma-sensitive approaches have shown tremendous success in California and across the country, in schools in San Francisco, Washington State, and the state of Massachusetts. They've been shown to improve academic performance and student attendance and to reduce behavioral challenges and the use of punitive discipline. Effective trauma-sensitive schools share the three following core components. First, at the outset, a consistent regime of ongoing training and consultation for all adults in the building, including teachers, administrators, counselors, and other staff, to understand student trauma and its effects, as well as how to proactively implement trauma interventions to mitigate the effect of trauma on learning and create conditions for learning readiness. Second, when problems do arise, trauma-sensitive schools respond to them, not with punitive suspensions or expulsions, which have been shown to only re-traumatize students, but with restorative practices that prevent, address, and promote healing after conflict. Third, for students with the most intensive needs, provision of consistent mental health intervention and support. Mr. Rosenbaum has already shared some about the consequences for students when these trauma-sensitive practices are not implemented. The research all shows that students are more likely to experience academic failure, be absent from school, experience behavioral challenges, and be suspended or expelled. The remarkable young people that you heard from by video this morning have all experienced these types of challenges firsthand. Kimberly Cervantes avoided school after a traumatic event in the classroom that the school failed to address. She ultimately did not have enough credits to graduate from a mainstream high school in Compton and had to transfer to a continuation school. Philip W., after the consistent and pervasive trauma that he endured as a young person, has trouble concentrating and focusing in class. He says that he often jokes around to distract himself from thinking about the events that he's experienced. In a single school year, he has been involuntarily removed from all three of Compton's mainstream high schools and is currently attending an alternative school. Although Peter P. has been able to achieve high grades in honors classes in the past, he has been homeless and sleeping on the roof of the school for the past 2 months. He's currently failing all but 2 classes. We filed this case today so that Kimberly, Philip, Peter, and all their classmates receive the support they need and are entitled to so that the trauma to which they've been so unjustly subjected does not become determinative of their education and life chances. I'd now like to introduce Laura Fair, the Statewide Education Rights Director for Public Counsel and another counsel on this case.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I want to close us out because I want to make certain that folks understand that the long-term impact of the changes and challenges that you've just heard about. So today, the landmark class action that has been filed really shines a bright light on the injustice of school exclusions for our students who have been exposed to heartbreaking trauma. As you heard, loss of parents, homelessness, witnessing extreme violence, and numerous friends and family members lost to violence, incarceration, and deportation. The medical science is now eminently clear and irrefutable. When the effects of complex trauma are not proactively addressed, children not only cannot access the educational rights they are guaranteed by law, but they are excluded and segregated in ways that re-traumatize and send a disturbing message that these students are disposable.
These children need all our care, support, and attention. Yet, as you've just heard, our children who endure trauma after trauma are far more likely to be removed from class, removed from school after school, and placed on the school to prison pipeline. This first of its kind case has a simple national message. Schools that ignore and fail to address the impact of trauma on students are engaging in unlawful discrimination. It is indisputable that trauma is a top predictor of suspensions, expulsions, and school-based referrals to law enforcement. Schools that fail to meet their obligations to become trauma-informed are denying students impacted by trauma meaningful access to education and frequently and unlawfully putting students on the school to jailhouse track. This unlawful exclusion must stop. And the good news, as you just heard from Catherine, is that there are research-based solutions that are effective at addressing the impact of trauma and reopening the schoolhouse doors. Today, we are seeking immediate implementation of these reasonable accommodations and modifications that draw on the resilience of the incredible young people you heard from, and that ensure that all school staff receive trauma-sensitive training and support so that students exposed to complex trauma can succeed. The time is now. Thank you. We're gonna open it up to questions now, and so you're able to ask them through the chat button. Sarah, you can maybe explain a little bit more about how folks can chime in with questions through the chat button.
Yes, thank you. So we are going to have time for questions right now. Of course, as you know, all of you have been muted. So in order to raise your hands and we'll get to all of your questions, you're going to see on the left side of your toolbar, there's a green or blue button that has a hand icon. And so go ahead and raise your hand and then we'll call on you and unmute you. Now, if that is not working, if your mic isn't working for some reason, please enter your question into the chat box and I will read them in order. Also, please enter your organization as well if you would like me to read that out. And we can get started that way. So I am now opening for questions. So if I see any hands raised, I'll ask your questions. There was a question that was entered earlier during the statements, and I will read that now. It's from Evie Blad, and she asks, couldn't some of these concerns be addressed by other civil rights laws? In parentheses, Title IV, in the case of sexual orientation, idea for students with emotional disabilities.
Well, in fact, the disability laws are being applied in this case, as Catherine and Laura and I have indicated. That's specifically the theory. That is that reasonable accommodations need to be made when there are impairments to everyday activities like thinking and learning and going to school, where schools in fact receive federal monies. So that is precisely the legal mandate that we've been talking about. Where there is discrimination based on sexual orientation or race, you're of course correct that those issues could be addressed. But I want to be clear about something here, and that is that the relief that we're seeking here is school-wide, that is, and district-wide. That is the concentrations of children who suffer extreme cases of stress, extreme complex trauma on multiple occasions. That requires the school to institute not just individual remedies, as is needed by individual children, but rather to have an entire school approach. That's what Laura was talking about, and that's what Catherine was talking about when we talk about the development and the implementation of trauma-sensitive schools. What we know is that where there are such high concentrations, the relief that is required is not one by one, but rather that the entire school be trained and supported to deal with these traumas. And your question raises another good related point, and that is that the case is brought on behalf of the children of the Compton Unified School District, but it's also being brought on behalf of teachers in that district. We know that teachers suffer what is called vicarious trauma by virtue of the fact that they teach in schools that have these sorts of experiences. That's why there are higher data numbers in terms of teacher absenteeism, of
All right, great. So we will now, Matt Holzman had a question about how many plaintiffs there are. All right, next we'll take a question from Jane Adams, who has her hand raised, and I've unmuted you, Jane. Can you ask your question?
education as a fundamental right. This is a different lawsuit. It unfortunately involves children in some of the same schools as is in the Cruz suit, but it is brought in federal court, and it is brought, as the prior question just indicated, based on federal law that mandates that there be reasonable accommodation to the impediments that these kids suffer. You know, if we had children who were in wheelchairs, we would say that schools, of course, needed to build ramps in order that children get inside the schoolhouse doors. This is the same thing. The trauma that these children experience work as impediments that keep them from being able to learn and think and thrive in school. We're asking for the same sort of accommodations, the same sort of support be given to these kids.
All right, thank you. The next question is from, and actually I think we lost the person who was asking the question. Oh, Celeste Freeman. I've unmuted you,
Hi.
Celeste.
Hi. This question, may be tangential, but in your research, how are you finding that kids are faring in schools if there has already been county intervention by either the foster care system or LA County Juvenile Probation or both? How does that play into the lives of the students in your observation?
I'm going to let Laura answer this, but it's a great question because the bottom line is that we know that where trauma-sensitive programs are implemented, kids thrive, that notwithstanding the damage that is done, if trauma is addressed, these kids can thrive like kids anywhere else. But Laura, do you want to talk to that in particular?
Sure, absolutely. Celeste, if we're waiting that long, if we're at that point, we've waited too long, right? We want to make certain what this case is about is ensuring that we have the supports and services in our schools that address this trauma on the front end. Because we believe strongly that if we can ensure access in our schools, we will actually make a breakage in what is the school to prison pipeline, right? We do not want to see our young people, and some of the young people in this case, who have ended up in our juvenile justice system. That is not the result that we're looking for, and we believe that schools have an imperative to change those outcomes. And so we're asking for, again, immediate relief in the form of these reasonable accommodations, which have been shown to disrupt that pipeline.
All right, great. Thank you, Laura. So we have another question from Matt Holzman, and he says, why Compton, a school district already under siege?
Well, you're right, Matt, that we could have selected any number of school districts in California where there are similarly high concentrations of kids who suffer multiple episodes of severe trauma. I think your question answers itself, though, in terms of Compton. These kids need opportunity, as Laura said, now. It's an urgent matter. And the fact that there are other issues certainly doesn't take away. If anything, it enforces the fact that trauma needs to be addressed so that these kids have a a fighting chance in the schools that they attend. I think your question spotlights another important point, and that is that these schools in high poverty neighborhoods where the achievement gaps are indefensible by any metric need to be addressed head on by all sorts of authorities. But the fact that there are other issues in these schools certainly doesn't take away from the fact that trauma needs to be addressed in order that these kids have a chance in Compton schools.
Great, thank you. And actually, Celeste had a follow-up question that I did not see, so I'll ask it now. She said, do those programs, and by programs she means DCFS and LA County Juvenile Probation, don't those programs make things worse? As in, are they trauma informed?
Laura, do you want to, and then Catherine talk about it too.
Sure. I think, Celeste, that I wouldn't want to speak broadly, with relation to this case. What we see, unfortunately, obviously on an individual basis, is that when there is a lack of coordination, in individual cases that we work on, there's a lack of coordination when those systems are not taking care to ensure that young people have school stability, that they are stable in their placements, that they're placed appropriately, and that, as you said, that they are trauma-informed in their approach to young people, that we do see that can have, obviously, an incredible impact and worsen the outcomes. In terms of the probation system, again, this case, while it's in Compton, has a national message, and what we're saying is that all systems that affect, generally, and obviously all systems that affect young people of this nature need to be trauma-informed. And so I know I'm not answering it directly with respect to the whole system for you, but I think in individual cases, sometimes we see that these systems can work together well and coordinate, but in a number of the cases that are highlighted here for these named plaintiffs, that has not been the case, and young people have suffered further harm as a result. And I'll turn it over to Catherine to explain a little bit more.
Just to reiterate what Laura said, the research shows that young people who have been involved in the foster system and have had multiple changed placements and instability in their lives, who have been involved in the juvenile justice system, are more likely to have experienced trauma and less likely to have the resilience necessary to really effectively respond after experiencing trauma. And so that's why it's just particularly essential that these types of accommodations and interventions are necessary and available in Compton School. I also wanted to add that multiple of the young people who are involved in this case have been involved in the juvenile justice system and the foster system, and thus are particularly vulnerable.
Thank you.
What's if I can add to that, what's really indefensible and shocking, if you think about it, is that our school systems, particularly systems that are in neighborhoods where children suffer multiple and severe stress, operate as if nothing is happening of that nature. It's as if the schools could be transplanted anywhere else. And that's really the point of this lawsuit. It is to say we have to pay attention to what these kids are going through, what's happening to them. So often we've heard stories where officials at the schools say to the students, "What's wrong with you?" instead of "What happened to you?" And when schools turn that around, which is what trauma-sensitive school systems do, when they turn that around and appreciate that these kids are facing extraordinary challenges in their lives at the same time that we're asking them to learn multiplication tables, that's when, in fact, they can begin to learn and to begin to prosper. You heard one of the students say that's what he was looking for. He was looking for a place where he could find some refuge and where individuals understood what he was going through at the same time that they were trying to deliver education. You heard Kimberly say what she was looking for is a friend, a support system. One of the teachers with whom I spoke, who is a veteran of the Compton school system, said that in all the trainings that she had ever been through, she never heard the word trauma mentioned, even though multiple of her children, of her students, had experienced, witnessed shootings. Some of her students had actually been killed while they were in school. Catherine and I went to a principal of one school, and we said to that principal, "How frequently do your students experience violence?" And the answer from the principal was, "Do you mean this week?" And that's what we're saying here. that we have to pay attention to the reality of these children's lives.
All right, so it looks as though we have a couple of questions coming from the phone, but I don't see, I can't unmute that person. So I'm hoping that Marie, our communications person, can enter those into the chat box because I'm unable to see that person. However, I saw that Jane had her hand raised again. So I will unmute Jane again. And Jane, can you let us know if you have another question or if that was left over from before?
Sure, this is Jane Adams at EdSource. I don't yet know specifically what you're asking for. Could you go through that? What do the teachers need and what do the students need and the whole school district?
So to reiterate, what the necessary accommodation is to address these issues is a whole school trauma-sensitive approach. And that includes three components. One is training, and there are different elements of training, but the core of it is such that every educator, including administrators, teachers, counselors, and staff, have information about the effects of trauma and how trauma impacts students in the classroom, how it impacts teachers, how it impacts the organization as a whole, such that teachers can respond effectively to students who are affected by trauma in the classroom, and can respond by de-escalating the situation rather than potentially re-traumatizing students. There are also proactive trauma interventions such as co-regulation and social-emotional skills that teachers can effectively deliver to their students with appropriate training. The other two elements are restorative practices, which perhaps Laura can talk a bit more about in detail, and intensive, for students with the most intensive needs, appropriate supportive mental health resources and counseling. Laura, do you want to talk a bit more about the restorative practices component?
Yeah, so and what we're talking about here is, a multi-tiered system of support. So you're going to have young people of who have experienced different levels of trauma. And so for young people who have higher levels of trauma, we want to make certain that they have immediate access to mental health supports and the provision of mental health. And in addition, with restorative practices, it's a whole school strategy and approach that allows for the creation of strong relationships. Because as Mark said, the young people we're talking about here desperately need those relationships, and they need them in their school buildings in the day to both feel safe and to be able to feel comfortable and to be able to access the portion of their brain to learn when they've been affected by trauma. And restorative practices functions on several levels, but not only does it help us ensure that there are strong relationships in a building and it creates a safe environment, but in addition, when there are conflicts and when there is struggle, it provides an approach that does not re-traumatize young people to actually explore that conflict, to discuss it as a community, and actually to come up with strategies and solutions that are healing and that also teach young people a different approach and a different way of interacting.
This is a lawsuit that I would think everyone in the school community would welcome. The teachers whom we spoke with, who are heroic, you heard one of the students talk about Mr. Curry, who responded to the student who was homeless living on the roof of the school. These teachers are being put in a position where they have to act as mental health specialists. This isn't a case about just adding mental health persons to schools. That's part of it. But at Compton, for example, the ratios of mental health trained individuals to students at schools are something like 700 to 1. And we're told that that mental health person isn't really there for the support we're talking about and is further burdened by responsibilities like attendance and discipline matters. So what we're talking about is an approach that says the entire community is suffering because of the trauma that exists in the communities where these students suffer, and that the entire community will benefit from an approach that takes it on, recognizes that it can be dealt with, and says teachers should be teachers, and teachers should be given support in the same way that students should be given support by an approach. And that's the same thing we would do in our lives, isn't it? You call this trauma-sensitive approach. It's been proven to work, but really what we're talking about is empathy bolstered by the sorts of techniques that we know actually reduce and mitigate trauma.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question from Susan Ferris. asking what about the costs of these remedies to the school? What if Compton says we don't have the money for this training and the time to do this?
Well, right now the cost of not addressing trauma is devastating these schools and these communities. Let me give you a few examples. Every time a student is absent from school, the school is deprived of the money that it needs to operate on. That's how our school finance system works in California. Schools receive money for every day that a student is in class. So where students are absent, where they drop out early, this is literally taking money out of the school's hands that it needs to take care of its other sorts of responsibilities. When teachers, and we know that teacher turnover and teacher absenteeism, the use of substitutes are extraordinarily costly. Where trauma operates, teacher absenteeism often rivals student absenteeism. Student-teacher turnover is a constant problem in Compton schools. We had students talk to us about being in rooms where all year they saw nothing but substitutes. That's an extraordinarily financial burden on the schools, and when they have to bring new teachers in, retrain those teachers, restart school reform issues, that is all taking money out of the school's hands that ought to be based on education. Furthermore, we know, and this is to a certainty, that when kids drop out, when kids cannot learn up to their potential, that the community suffers. That's the problem here, that students are not given an opportunity to achieve their dreams, to become productive individuals in a society, as we expect of children attending schools everywhere. So even if you didn't care a whit about these kids or trauma, from a financial standpoint, what is required is that we address trauma now. And if Compton doesn't have the funds for these matters, then Compton needs to go to the state of California, and we'll help them with respect to that. Because ultimately the state of California is responsible for assuring that all children receive their legal rights to an education. That's where the buck stops if Compton doesn't really have the funds. But this isn't a matter of money, and it's not a matter of financial resources. It's a matter of will and knowledge. There are, as Laura and Catherine said, school communities across the country, across the state, that have functioned with trauma-sensitive programs, and those schools have turned around. As I said earlier, if we really want to reduce the achievement gap in this country, and it is that achievement gap that is depleting the economies of our communities, and particularly these communities, we really want to address the achievement gap between have and have-not communities, then the first thing we do is address trauma.
And I just want to reinforce what Mark said. What we know is that in those schools and in those districts that they are actually addressing trauma and they're putting in place these research-based approaches, we're seeing dramatic increases in attendance and reductions in suspensions. And what that means is more funding coming into the door. And some schools who've done that have reported that they actually are bringing in more money. So this is a win-win solution, because it means more young people graduating, succeeding, and it also means higher attendance rates for our young people and more money for schools. So there really is no excuse for not doing this when we know how so clearly from the medical science, which is truly irrefutable, that this is an issue that is denying young people access to education.
Thank you. And then we had a question from Evie Glad. Evie's hand was raised, and so Evie, I've unmuted you. I think her microphone may not be working, so I will look in the chat box to see. Okay, great. Yes. Evie has a question saying, have any of the student plaintiffs been diagnosed with IDEA recognized disabilities such as emotional disturbances?
So again, this is a case not brought under the IDEA. It's a ADA and Rehabilitation Act case, and the reason for that is that the correct approach to addressing trauma, particularly in schools like Compton's, where there are high concentrations of students who are experiencing the effects of complex trauma, are not the individualized type of remedy that the IDEA prescribes, but these broader school-wide approaches that we've talked about, school-wide training, school-wide restorative practices, and then only in cases where the most intensive support is required, mental health support.
You know, federal law is right on the button on this. Federal law says But in order for, accommodations to be made, or the requirement for accommodations, what's required is that there be impairments to everyday activities like thinking, learning, concentrating, studying. That's what the case is about. It's not about particular clinical diagnosis. It's about what gets in the way of children learning and making sure that schools do what's required. And nobody disputes the fact that childhood trauma can, and most frequently does, get in way of the brain. It literally turns off the learning switch of the brain. And that's what the case is about. A school-wide approach that says to all kids, all teachers, all members of the community, that learning counts. You're not disposable children, and we can create the conditions by which you can learn just like your peers in any other school.
Yes, and she also had a follow-up question saying that she knew that it wasn't under IDEA, but she also wanted to still know if any of the students had IDEA disabilities.
Some of them do.
Thank you. All right.
I think just to clarify too that this same set of disabilities that are in terms of functionally an IDEA disability is there's, I guess I would say to you that if a young person has been diagnosed with a disability, then that is a disability that they can't be discriminated against under all the laws that we're talking about.
All right, thank you. So I don't have any other, I think we've caught up on all our questions. Again, I just wanted to remind people, maybe if you joined later or you couldn't, you didn't hear the instructions about raising your hand. If you look at the left side of your Citrix toolbar, the Go-To Training toolbar, you will see that there's a green or blue button at the bottom that has a hand icon. So if you are unable to raise your hand or your mic isn't working, you can also just enter your question in the chat box here at the bottom of your toolbar. So I'll go ahead and let other people raise their hands or ask any questions if they want. I'll give a couple of minutes for that.
And also, while we're waiting, one of the things I just wanted to note also is in the materials that you all have, there are a number of additional quotes from other young people and from leaders in Compton. So if you look on the last page of the press kit, you'll see some of the additional statements. Folks who could not be with us actually in person today, but wanted to comment on the impact of the case on the community and actually, statewide and nationally.
One of the things we did in preparing this case and investigating this case was to talk to community groups throughout Compton, and also groups like Children Now that work with these sorts of issues, and the California Endowment. And the statements of support and contact individuals are listed on the site that Laura mentions. We wouldn't be in the place we're in without the California Endowment, without Children Now, and certainly without those community groups. I also want to say that they've been silent on this case, but this case would not have been filed in the manner in which it did without the assistance of an extraordinary law firm, Irell and Manella, led by Morgan Chu. And we want to acknowledge their assistance and partnership in this matter. The website is www.traumaandlearning.org, www.traumaandlearning.org. And for those of you who joined late, copies of the complaint and copies of the student video are available on that website.
As well as letters of support and quotes of support from community organizations in Compton and statewide that Laura mentioned.
Yes, thank you, Mark and Catherine. And I've entered that also for everyone who can see their chat function. I've chatted it out to everyone so that you can just kind of cut and paste and put it in your browser. And I don't see any other hands raised. So I believe that we can begin closing.
Well, we want to thank you all for your participation in this terribly important matter. We appreciate your attendance, your questions, and all of us are available to answer questions down the line if you contact us later today or as the case develops. And we will be posting all filings and all developments regarding the case on the website that we just identified.
Oh, and Yes, I said that we would close, and then I just got message that Center for Public Integrity. I wanted to just identify that Susan Ferris is with the Center for Public Integrity, and so and I didn't do that earlier. But all right, great. Thank you everyone for joining us. And if you have any other questions, or you know, everyone here is available for follow-up interviews, and the students also have some availability for interviews as long as they remain anonymous. So you can go ahead and contact us here at Public Counsel. You can contact Marie, and I'll put in these all the information for who you want to contact: Mark, Catherine, Laura, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.